I'm John Lewis, and you're listening to 360 Degree City, a podcast where we talk to people who are working to make cities better. Our hope is that after each episode, you'll start to see your own city from a slightly different angle. 360 Degree City is brought to you by the team at Intelligent Futures. We're a team of versatile urban problem solvers, and our aim is to figure out better ways of living together. Have you ever heard the ribbit of a frog as you're walking through your neighborhood? Ever see a collection of logs that have been smoothly chipped down by beavers? Maybe that's more for Canadian listeners. Or maybe you just like to spend time at the river that runs through your city. There are all kinds of these examples, but it's often easy to forget that the skyscrapers, pipes, and roads of our cities are connected with natural ecosystems. Over the past year, our team at Intelligent Futures has been working on a couple of environmental master plans. The focus of this work is better integrating our natural systems into how we build our cities. And people often think about cities as being separate from nature, but the reality is that cities are intimately connected with the natural systems that support all life. There's a concept called ecological services that's worth understanding when we think about our cities. So basically, ecological services talk about the activities that naturally occur in nature. For example, a wetland naturally cleans the water, and a tree naturally cleans the air, and all these things happen for free. Now, as more and more people move into cities, I think it's important to continually improve how we integrate our natural and urban systems in all kinds of ways. With all this in mind, we thought we would talk to someone who understands that relationship between natural systems and cities.
My name is Danah Duke, and I'm the Executive Director of the Mistakis Institute.
And what is the Mistakis Institute for folks that don't know?
The Mistakis Institute, we're a conservation research institute, and all of our work at Mistakis is about getting information into the hands of decision makers so they can make better decisions with respect to conservation.
In this episode, Danah and I talk about her work at the Mistakis Institute, the relationship between natural systems and cities, how some cities are recognizing the importance of biodiversity, how citizens can work with scientists to learn more about wildlife, and the importance of green infrastructure and natural systems. You've been with Mistakis for 15 years, did I see that right?
18.
18.
I haven't updated our website.
There you go. So could you maybe describe your path of how you got to Mistakis and the variety of things that you've done within the Institute in your time there?
Sure. So my background is in biology and ecology. So I studied biology at McMaster University as an undergrad, and I always had an interest in ecology, the natural world, specifically wildlife. And so when I graduated from my undergraduate degree, I packed up my car from Ontario and I drove west. I knew there was research going on in wolves in Banff National Park, and I was really interested in seeing if I could get involved. And so I came west and I studied actually wolves in Banff for a number of years. And then I did my master's at the University of Alberta. And then from there, I started at the Mistakis Institute. And I've stayed at the Mistakis Institute for so many years because the Mistakis Institute undertakes such a wide diversity of research. And after all this time, I'm still learning. All the work we do is so diverse and allows me to just keep learning all the time.
Mm-hmm. Great. Mm-hmm. And I have to tell you that the learning, obviously sharing your learning is a big part of what you do. And at our shop, we've utilized a lot of your research and work. Most recently last year when we were doing work on ephemeral and intermittent streams policy.
Oh, that's great. That's really great to hear because it's really important feedback for us, but it's also hard feedback to get because we work really hard at Mistakis to get our information accessible and out there. That's our mandate as a charity. And it's really important for us to get that feedback of when people have used it, especially people often use it in contexts that we don't think they necessarily will use it in. And that's really important for us to hear as well.
Yeah. That was an interesting project for us because, first of all, we had to learn ourselves about what ephemeral and intermittent streams are. And then when we're talking with our professional colleagues about it, we spend the same amount of time explaining to them and looking around North America. There's not a lot of policy and information on it. So we were kind of creating things from scratch. So resources like what was available in terms of planning tools and tools that you've researched and shared was hugely beneficial. Ephemeral and intermittent streams are transient bodies of water. So what that means is that these streams come and go based on precipitation levels. Although these types of watercourses aren't always present, they're still very valuable in that they provide natural services such as flood mitigation, wildlife habitat, and water filtration. The transient nature of these streams often makes them targets for development. These streams are also usually forgotten in planning and policy and how cities get built. In 2017, our team at Intelligent Futures learned everything we could about ephemeral and intermittent streams when we created planning policy on the subject for the city of Calgary. Although we learned a lot over the many months working on the project, it never got easier to pronounce ephemeral and intermittent streams. So I wanted to chat with you today about the intersection of what people would see as nature and cities. So oftentimes when folks think about cities and behave in cities, etc., they see those two things as separate entities. So the city exists, and then if you want to get away from it all, you might go to a park maybe, but you also might just get out of the city to access nature. But could you maybe talk about the relationship between natural systems and cities, and some of the things that you think are most important for a citizen of a city to understand that maybe the average citizen might not?
Sure. And I think you're exactly right that I think a lot of people think of natural systems as being not part of an urban setting. Mm-hmm. And it's not true at all. That biodiversity is really important within urban environments. And biodiversity is the variety and variability of all life on Earth. Mm-hmm. And so there's a real continuum of that there is a lot of biodiversity in certain places in the world. And people tend to think that we don't have that in our cities, mm-hmm. but we do. We have lots of areas within cities that are hotspots of biodiversity. And more importantly, we have these systems within our cities, mm-hmm. these natural ecosystems. And I think people tend to forget how important those ecosystems and systems are for our cities, because they provide really important ecosystem services to city dwellers. The ecosystem services that biodiversity contributes to, that's what gives us our clean air, our water, provides our regulating systems, carbon cycling, provides our recreational opportunities, all these ecosystem services. And those are provided by the biodiversity that's right here in our city. That's not necessarily provided to us from elsewhere. They're all part of these connected systems that mm-hmm. cities are part of.
And could you maybe speak to, I guess, traditionally, and I'll define traditionally as, the majority of the 20th century, let's say, how we've planned and built cities and how those have worked or not with those natural systems and what those implications have been?
Well, I think one of the biggest challenges we've had when we've built our cities is that we haven't been thinking about biodiversity proactively in our planning for our cities. We have thought about our natural systems and biodiversity reactively. So we think about it after a development has happened, and we think about the impact we've had on it, and not thinking proactively about, we have this system here, we have this biodiversity that's providing these ecosystem services, and we need to plan to be able to maintain those and conserve those. Mm-hmm. And so we're not putting those things forefront in our city and urban planning.
Cities around the world are exploring ways to bring back natural systems after paving them over in one way or another. In Seoul, South Korea, the Cheonggyecheon stream has been surfaced after decades of being under an elevated highway. In Los Angeles, there are plans for an over $1 billion restoration of parts of the Los Angeles River. An article I saw recently on Yale Environment 360 poses some important questions for LA. With the full restoration out of the picture, a different tangle of philosophical and practical questions remain. How far do you go to create a natural environment in a city? Is it enough just to make a concrete drainage ditch prettier? How much of the project should focus on removing concrete and creating some semblance of a functioning riverine ecosystem? These two examples highlight how hard and expensive it is to react to engineered solutions of the past in order to bring prominence and function back to our natural systems in our cities. Could you maybe talk about your observation of perhaps the mindsets and perhaps the policy extension of those mindsets in terms of why that's happened, in that fragmentation and sort of you haven't proactively planned it at the start. Does that make sense?
Yeah, well, and I think it goes back to, we don't think of biodiversity as being part of our urban environment. And I think we have to be really proactive. And individually, I think we often think that, as people living in the city, we want to live in a place where we see wildlife, we have natural areas. But I think there's a real conscious decision by people that needs to happen that if we want to have those things, sometimes that will result in an individual or personal sacrifice, if you may. It means that people will have to make certain choices that allow that to happen. And I think that rolls up so from individual behaviors then right up to management and political decisions that we're making consciously that we want to make sure that we maintain and have those things on the landscape.
Mm-hmm. Maybe you could talk about some of the creative solutions that cities are enacting to address some of these issues. And I think it's interesting you mentioned, there's the individual citizen level, and then there's all kinds of professionals, engineers and planners and architects and designers, right up to elected officials. Where are some of the places that are doing some really innovative stuff to help address this issue?
Well, there's some great examples in Canada of some cities that are really looking at biodiversity and recognizing the importance of biodiversity within cities. And of course, I think there's lots of international examples, but the examples in Canada, two cities, Edmonton and Montreal, are really recognized as leaders in how they're recognizing the importance of biodiversity for human well-being. And so both these cities are taking, it's called an ecological network approach. So it's looking at the entire system, ecosystem that exists within cities. And it's really about how you look at the connections that are happening between species and with biodiversity that you have. And it's really looking at how energy is being transferred. It's looking at carbon cycling. It's looking at predation. It's looking at competition. So when you take this ecological network approach, it allows you to look at the stability of systems and how they're structured, because then allows you to identify your systems to be able to know what you have to do to manage them and what you have to do to restore them. And so taking an ecological network approach is, I think, an innovative approach. Not we don't see that happening in a lot of cities. I think it can be thought of as in cities, we manage a lot of our systems from a network approach, whether that's our transportation systems, our pedestrian systems, our water systems, and we really need to be thinking of our ecosystems from this system approach. And we look at then how then our ecosystems are overlaid and connect and interconnect with our transportation systems, our pedestrian systems, because then we look for those areas of conflict, because then we can manage those proactively. Right. And so I think it's natural for us to think of all these other systems, but we need to be thinking of our natural world more from a systematic approach.
Okay. And so could you give an example of taking this system or network approach? You can choose if it's park space, if it's urban development, a housing development. What would look or feel different if a city took that approach? Would there be anything tangibly, like I say, different for the average citizen that would be living there or walking through a space?
Well, I think an example that people could recognize with, a lot of people like to live near green space, because green space affords places to recreate, provides places you can walk with your family. But those green spaces are probably part of a network. They provide connections to other habitat nodes and provide areas of movement for animals, provides, part of the water movement system as well. And I think that might result in how people think of green spaces, because it might mean that in areas that we identify as being important for wildlife movement within a city, it might mean that we have to think about are these areas that we want to walk our pets off leash if that's going to provide less security for wildlife. It makes us think about how we manage the vegetation in these landscapes. In cities, we tend to like manicured landscapes. That often doesn't provide the most optimal opportunities for pollination, or it might allow for the introduction of invasive species. And so I think when you think about how we manage these green spaces, natural areas within a city, I think there's probably things that citizens will need to change their behavior in so that we can make them the best opportunities for the biodiversity.
Okay. I know you've been involved with citizen science activities. Could you maybe describe what citizen science is and some of the efforts that you've been involved with?
Sure. So citizen science is really about volunteers working with scientists to answer real world questions. And at Mestakis, we've been interested in citizen science for a number of years because we feel that, citizens are facing these really complex conservation challenges. And we feel that the solutions to those are really about having the information you need to make better decisions, but it's also about having an informed and engaged citizenry. And so citizen science brings those two worlds together. And so citizen science allows you to use citizens to collect really valuable data, and at the same time, they're getting engaged and informed about an issue. And so we have two urban citizen science initiatives that we're working on at Mestakis with a number of different partners. One is called Call of the Wetland. So this is a wetland urban citizen science initiative. And we undertook this because we recognize wetlands as being an important part of urban environments. They provide a lot of ecosystem services from water storage, enhancing resiliency of cities, providing habitat for species. But there's a real challenge with wetlands in that, we've lost over 90% of our wetlands within our urban environment. They're fragmented, they're not connected, they're not included, they're not looked at as part of these systems. And so, unfortunately, though, we also don't know a lot about our wetlands within the city. And so we have undertook a research project to look at amphibians within wetlands, because amphibians can be seen as an indicator of wetland health. And because we don't know a lot about amphibians, we needed the help of citizens to help us gather that data we needed to learn more about amphibians. And so Call of the Wetland allows citizens, all citizens in Calgary, to be able to go out to wetlands that we have identified, to go out and with the help of a mobile app, they can document the amphibians they're seeing, but also the amphibians that they're hearing. And so often you hear amphibians before you see them. And so you can hear the calls, and the app includes, you can hear the calls on the app, so you'll know the difference between the different species. And you can also record what you're hearing, and then that will get sent to us so we can verify it as well. And then we're also, if you actually see an amphibian as well, that you can document. And so that information then, this was designed in partnership with the City of Calgary to inform their biodiversity strategy. And so this information is being shared with the City of Calgary. It's being shared with the province of Alberta. So ultimately, we'll be able to do what's called occupancy modeling. So that will be able to tell us about amphibian populations in the City of Calgary, but then ultimately feed into how we manage these wetlands. What can we be doing better to ensure that we have healthy amphibian populations?
This Call of the Wetland resource that Danah discussed is really interesting. I have to admit that I lost quite a bit of time listening to different frog sounds. Did you know that a chorus frog sounds like this? Then there's the adult Canadian toad, which has a pretty shrill call. The northern leopard frog. If you're interested in more identifying features of different amphibians in the Calgary area, we put the link in the show notes. Yeah. And so what you get in that solution, in that approach then, is citizens that are, like you say, they're learning as they're being engaged, which is, very different than, seeing a poster somewhere that
Most
says
definitely.
you should do this or learn this.
Well, yeah, even for me, I mean, I know about the importance of wetlands. However, I did not know that one, how many wetlands were in proximity to my house, and how biodiverse they were. We all bike by wetlands in our neighborhoods, and we have so many wetlands in the city of Calgary. Some that are in really great shape, but some that are not in great shape. And what we have found already. So we're in the second year of this is a 3-year program. What we have found is that volunteers that have participated have already started providing comments, which they can do within the app, of concerns they have about what they're seeing in these wetlands. A lot of garbage, a lot of dumping. And already those comments have been compiled and submitted to the City of Calgary, which they've already started to respond to, doing a bit of cleanup of some of these wetlands that need some more attention. And so right there is showing the success of people being engaged in what is a data collecting and monitoring program into trying to get something done to improve the health of these wetlands.
Yeah, so you can see the positive steps of engagement leads to increased knowledge, leads to action, leads to ownership, and the sort of virtuous cycle that can create.
Yes.
Very cool.
Yeah.
Very cool. So as you're talking, I'm thinking about some of the conversations we've had with on a variety of different projects, but the skeptical citizen that comes in and says, well, like a city, my water goes in a pipe. The city takes care of it. This is just either fluff or unnecessary added expense. What would you say to someone that had that kind of approach or attitude when we're talking about the natural systems in our cities?
I guess I would say that that's true, that there's a lot of systems in place that look after a lot of the things we need, but I think there's a lack of understanding of how many services that nature provides us that for water for free exactly,
because that attitude is often associated with an idea of cost and tax dollars, etc. Right?
Exactly, and I think there's a lot of studies out there that calculate the monetary value of the services that nature provide, and they're big numbers. And I think in a city, and there's examples of other cities that have invested in upland habitat protection that then have resulted in millions of dollars of cost savings from a water treatment perspective. And so cities where there's examples in New York State where they recognized they were having pollution problems and the cost it was going to take to upgrade their water treatment systems. And instead they invested in upland habitat protection through land securement, and it resulted in huge cost savings for the city. And so people reckon, again, it's thinking about not just your city, but these systems perspective that our water comes from somewhere. And if it reaches the city in a poor state, then that's more onus on the city to have to treat that water. And so there's lots that we can be thinking about from where our water is coming from, what we're contributing into that water system to reduce the burden on how much we have to treat that water. And from a resiliency perspective, we all saw the impacts of the flood that we had in Calgary. And there's a lot of natural resiliency built into the system, into our natural systems. And unfortunately, we've reduced a lot of that natural resiliency because of our built environment. And but we can restore some of that. We can put some of that back. We can really look at our natural systems to see where resiliency is built into these systems to make sure that we're maintaining that, so that when we have natural disasters like flood and also drought, I think that we live in a part of the world where we are prone to drought, and having systems in place where we can store water, we can cool water, it reduces the burden then that our unnatural systems have to take on.
Let's chat a bit about climate change and resiliency and adaptation and all those things. You spoke about some of the impacts. Can you also maybe describe why working with natural systems is what some of those other impacts could be, as we're seeing with increased impact of climate change? But also one of the things that I find interesting is the idea that again, it relates back to the city or nature. And so if you are working with natural systems, the assumption would be that you're just kind of handing it off. Humans are stepping back, but there's actually environmental design that works, intentionally designs with natural systems in mind. Realize that's kind of a long-winded, rambling question, but could you maybe talk about how those two things can work together? Because maybe even the beaver project you talked about before we started recording, because I do think that we have to figure out ways to design and address these, and how can natural systems design accommodate change?
And it's kind of, you hear a lot about gray infrastructure and green infrastructure, and our urban environments tend to have a lot of gray infrastructure, a lot of built, constructed, and there's more and more emphasis now on the importance of green infrastructure and how natural systems can provide similar types of services as gray infrastructure. And so an example of that is looking at the role that beavers play in watershed resiliency and restoration. And so, beavers are a species that we have on our landscape. They've been in Alberta for thousands of years. We used to have a lot more beavers in Alberta than we do now. And beavers play an extremely important role in watersheds from a resiliency perspective. They store water from the beaver ponds. The dams that they built then result in beaver ponds, which hold a lot of water. And they can also reduce the impact from flooding by holding back water from a flood. And so we're undertaking a research project right now where we're trying to promote that role of beavers, recognizing that landowners who are out there, whether they're ranchers and have to have water on the landscape to water their cattle, or agricultural producers, having beavers on the landscape can help enhance that resiliency that we're seeing, that we have seen from flood and probably will see more in the future from drought. And so having more beavers on the landscape would result in enhancing that resiliency. And so we're working to try to let landowners know that there's coexistence tools, because we recognize that while there are natural solutions to some of these things, some of them come at a cost, and that's that beavers do cause damage. They flood areas, they take down prized trees. And so there are things you can do to reduce the damage that beavers cause so that people are more amenable to having and coexisting with them on the landscape. And I think coexistence is a big theme that we focus on a lot, is that recognizing that if we really want to integrate more with our natural systems, we have to think about how humans coexist on the landscape with wildlife, whether that's with beavers or whether that's with wildlife in city environments. I think there's a lot that we have to do on the human side of things to think about how we coexist with wildlife.
And I found it interesting when we were chatting about it, how your work intends to inform decision makers so citizens can make individual decisions all day. And some of the work you just described helps to understand landowners and how they can coexist. But your point of up the decision-making chain, there's actual policy that would be in place if big mindset and practice changes were to happen at the individual level. Policy at this time doesn't actually support that. Could you maybe expand on that a bit?
It's something I touched on earlier, just that a lot of managing for biodiversity in mind has to be really proactive. And that means it has to be considered at the highest level of planning. And so whether that's in your municipal development plans, where biodiversity is driving policy decisions. So that, and it means that you have to understand your ecological networks within an urban environment prior to planning happening. And I think that that's a real missing piece, that people don't understand how their systems are structured. And so they're not able to make those decisions as well proactively. So I think first and foremost that we need to be thinking about how biodiversity can be driving some of the municipal planning processes. And we're starting, I think, to see that happening in some municipalities, but I do think there's a lag between some of the planning in municipalities and then citizens, because I don't think a lot of citizens there are then recognizing the importance of biodiversity and that these decisions are going to require investment. And of course, there has to be citizen support for a lot of those investments.
So the places that you've seen that are making those shifts, is it primarily coming from kind of the professional level? Are those folks the drivers, or are they political?
Like the places I mentioned, like Edmonton and Montreal, they've kind of taken this three-prong approach where they've recognized that in order to really elevate the importance of biodiversity within urban environments, they look at it from a policy perspective, they look at it from a partnership perspective, and from a citizen engagement perspective. So from a policy, they're really integrating biodiversity in the highest level of their planning. Yeah. But then I think just as important for them is partnerships. They're recognizing that within an urban environment, so much of the land base is privately owned, that they have to really develop these partnerships with them, whether it's individual landowners, companies that actually own a lot of the land base as well, to try to really elevate that understanding of the importance of biodiversity so that decisions can be made at individual levels, industry level, along with the municipal level, because municipalities can't do this on their own. They have to be really thinking about what partnerships do they really need to be building to make that happen. And then part of that then is citizen engagement and education. It's all about, there's lots of education programming out there. It's the citizen science, engaging people in these programs so they can start to understand the importance of biodiversity more. There's another urban citizen science initiative going on in the city of Calgary. So for people within Calgary that are interested in getting involved, it's a biodiversity initiative. It's called Calgary Captured. And this is a partnership initiative. It's with the city of Calgary. It's with Alberta Parks. It's with the Glenmore Weaselhead Preservation Society and Friends of Fish Creek. And this project was designed because recognizing we know biodiversity is important, but again, we don't really know that much about what critters are where. And this is a project that uses remote cameras. So we have remote cameras. We have 60 of them set up all over the city in green spaces. And so these cameras are catching images of wildlife and people as they move through these areas. But the way where citizens can get involved is you can imagine we get hundreds, thousands of images from these cameras, and we need to classify them. And so these images are uploaded onto a online citizen science platform. It's called Zooniverse. It's actually a really cool citizen science platform that actually houses all kinds of citizen science platforms from astronomy, history, biology that people sitting at home can get involved in. So all of the images from Calgary Captured are uploaded onto this platform. And so anyone sitting at home can go on to Calgary Captured and help us classify all of these images. And it's really cool. It's like being a little spy out there, and you get to see what's been walking through our green spaces in the city of Calgary. And so this information is really going to help us understand what's where, look at trends over time, and then ultimately we want to look at, where are some hot spots for movement that we can then maybe drill down a little bit closer and start to identify, is this an area, and again, this is that bringing it back to being proactive. Do we want to be facilitating movement through some of these areas and not others, because you don't want to be creating conflict with humans in areas that that could be conflict, and you want to maybe be thinking about facilitating movement where it's more secure for wildlife and others. And so so Calgary Captured is an opportunity for people to get involved if they want to help classify these images, and you get to see some really cool images of wildlife.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Okay, so we'll definitely put a link to that on the show notes. Yeah, great. Okay, and the final question that we ask all our guests is, can you share a city that you love and why you love it?
Well, I'll quantify that by saying I'm not a city gal. I grew up on a farm, and I love more rural landscapes. But I think then what I love about Calgary, which to me is a great city, is that there are so many opportunities for me to be in the city of Calgary and not feel like I'm in a city. And I think that's a really special thing. And I think it's something that as Calgarians, we're really lucky to have, that any day, I live up in the northwest of the city, and I can walk into Nose Hill Park and I don't see the city, I don't hear the city. And I think that we're really lucky. And we're really lucky that for the amount of like the biodiversity that we have, we can still see wildlife. I still see moose, I still see coyotes, and we're really lucky. My colleague had a lynx with her kitten in his backyard, nursing the kitten. And that was right in the middle of the city. And I think, we're really fortunate to live in a city that still has this amount of biodiversity, and that hopefully we can maintain it.
In his book, Cities and Natural Processes, Michael Huff wrote, "An environmental view is an essential component of the economic, engineering, political, and design processes that shape cities." I think that's a really great way of saying that we need to incorporate the environment into how we build our cities of the future. I think this is a dual challenge, both retrofitting our concrete solutions of the past and also proactively thinking about the design and function of our natural systems when we're building new parts of our cities. With more and more of us living in cities, we can't afford to ignore the natural systems that support us. On top of her work as the executive director of the Mistakis Institute, Danah is also the co-board chair for the Alberta EcoTrust Foundation, an environmental nonprofit that develops partnerships between the corporate sector and the environmental community here in Alberta. Together, they invest in the people and projects that protect the natural systems that Albertans rely on for their health and prosperity. And as part of their work to promote the environment as the foundation of a healthy community, they hold an annual environmental gathering to bring people and organizations together to explore and participate in positive environmental action. The environmental gathering is the only place in Alberta where people in the environmental community, private sector, government, and citizens can gather to connect, learn from each other's perspectives, and collaborate to find new solutions to the hard and complex environmental challenges that we all face. The environmental gathering is a place where everyone's voice is part of the conversation. This year's program uses the United Nations 17 Sustainable Development Goals as a lens for environmental work in Alberta. You'll find speakers and workshops focused on ideas related to a lot of what Danah spoke about in this podcast. Mistakis will have a citizen science booth. Many other topics related to UN Sustainable Development Goals will be covered, such as sustainable cities and communities, responsible consumption and production, affordable and clean energy, and climate action. We're also going to be at the event. 360 Degree City will have a podcast booth on site. We'll be asking attendees questions about the connections between environmental and urban health. Kate and Cassandra from our team at Intelligent Futures are also facilitating a workshop on user experience mapping. The event takes place on April 4th and 5th at Mount Royal University here in Calgary. Early bird tickets are available before February 28th, and you can reserve a spot by going to www.albertaecotrust.com/gathering. 360 Degree City is created by our team at Intelligent Futures. To learn more about the work we do, go to intelligentfutures.ca. I'm John Lewis. Thanks for stopping by.